Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, May 5th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about some breaking news that is likely to benefit the Democratic Party and Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff, as the incumbent Republican Governor Brian Kemp, who holds a high level of approval across the state, announces today that he's passing on a run for Senate. A widely anticipated move from Brian Kemp was largely that he would run for Senate. Republicans across the country, including President Donald Trump, have advocated for Brian Kemp to run for a Senate race that they believed he could win. Now, incumbent Democrat Jon Ossoff, you might remember his name if you've been watching my videos for a while, because he ran for Senate back in 2020. But even before then, he ran for House in 2017, to which he lost his race in the special election against Karen Handel. 3 years later, ended up becoming a United States Senator. But this is the first true test for Jon Ossoff in a day and age of a post-Trump victory in Georgia. In 2020, Joe Biden had defeated Donald Trump in the state of Georgia by roughly 0.23%. It wasn't a massive margin, but the expectation was that if Joe Biden could defeat Donald Trump, chances were that in the runoff election, the other Democrats could too. But Jon Ossoff had to make up ground. In the Senate races earlier on, he actually did not win a majority of the vote, and neither did David Perdue, the incumbent Republican senator. But David Perdue was actually only off by roughly 0.3% from winning an outright majority in the initial Georgia election. Jon Ossoff, on the other hand, was roughly 3 points down. And so Jon Ossoff, in the span of around 2 months, was able to campaign from being in a position where he was slated potentially to lose that Senate race to actually defeating an incumbent Republican governor who had been first elected in the previous cycle in 2014. Now, Jon Ossoff winning the race in 2021 was a big reckoning point for the GOP, because it wasn't just that Kelly Loeffler, who was the appointed incumbent in the Senate race there, was defeated by Raphael Warnock. Jon Ossoff nearly matched the margin of Raphael Warnock, an improvement off of Joe Biden's margin back in the 2020 election, with Joe Biden being the first Democrat to win Georgia since 1992. And so that in itself was noteworthy for the Democratic Party and noteworthy for Jon Ossoff in the long run. And now, 6 years later, or roughly 6 years later, getting on that, and roughly, next November, we'll be looking at Jon Ossoff again this time around. But the only difference between David Perdue and the slate of elections this time was that 2026, coming after Donald Trump's victory in Georgia in 2024, raised a lot of questions about what happens if Brian Kemp, the Republican governor in Georgia, decides to run for Senate. A lot of the early polls had indicated that the Senate race would not be super easy for Democrats if Brian Kemp decided that he wanted to run. Now, first and foremost, if he was in the race, that he was doing well when it came down to the prospective candidates. Most people had announced that if Brian Kemp was to run for Senate, that they would indeed not run. But now today, that seems to be entirely thrown out. Brian Kemp, of course, declining a run has paved the pathway for many Republicans across the state, but notably Marjorie Taylor Greene, the U.S. representative from Georgia's 14th district. And that makes a huge difference on the landscape for the Georgia elections. Because like I said, the expectation was that Brian Kemp was going to run. Why? Because he was the only Republican in polling who could defeat Jon Ossoff, at least according to the data. Time and time again, Republicans have tried to field candidates to take down statewide Democrats like Raphael Warnock, who has practically ran 4 elections in the past 4 years. Brian Kemp and Jon Ossoff was going to be the race that was going to define how Georgia voted, especially in a Democratic wave year, which is expected of 2026. But as you can see in the data, Jon Ossoff is handily defeating every other Republican, even tied with the generic Republican brand, which lends itself to allowing voters to build up an idea of an ideal Republican and deciding, do I want that Republican over Jon Ossoff? Together, it was tied. The only Republican, again, that could ever defeat Jon Ossoff in these polls was Brian Kemp. But the reason I think we see Brian Kemp stepping back from this race is a compounding 2 factors. On one end, I think Brian Kemp has ambitions beyond the United States Senate. And I think that's something that was being weighed in this decision. If he wasn't running for Senate, chances are he's going to run for president in 2028. But another factor, too, is that Jon Ossoff also is a uniquely strong candidate. Like I said, he defeated a Republican incumbent under circumstances where arguably he really should not have been, right? He was able to outperform and exceed the expectations set for him. Back in 2019, when Jon Ossoff decided that he was running for Senate, everybody saw him and Raphael Warnock largely as sacrificial lambs, right? No one was expecting them to do as well as they did. That came seemingly out of nowhere, a lot of it in combination with the fact that there was a new type of Democratic brand brand forming in Georgia, and voters were latching onto it. And Jon Ossoff very much represents that brand. But what you can see here again is that Brian Kemp, in the most recent poll from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, was defeating Jon Ossoff at baseline by roughly 3 points. But that's why I also think it weighed into the decision about why Brian Kemp might not run. As a governor who holds an approval rating that hovers around 60% and in some cases is above 60% against Jon Ossoff, is only doing as well of beating him by roughly 3 points. Now that's with the national approval rating for Donald Trump being -6, -7, with the Democratic generic ballot lead of being just roughly 1 or 2 points. What happens if you reach a 2018 type of scenario where Democrats are running ahead nationally by 6 to 7 points better than where they are today, and Donald Trump's approval rating is 6 to 7 points worse than where it is today? Chances are Brian Kemp would have been given a run for his money, and if Brian Kemp actually lost the race in 2026, his presidential ambitions and any future electoral ambitions would largely be doomed. And so now with Brian Kemp out of the race, the expectation has shifted that Marjorie Taylor Greene and other Republicans might enter into this race. The reason I see her as this next person to go to, one is the fact that she leads in polling. A recent data survey from Trafalgar shows that Marjorie Taylor Greene, when under the assumption of everybody else in the race, leads in these polls with 43% of the vote. You take her out, Mike Collins moves up, but neither of which are particularly notable or particularly electable, especially in a year like 2026. Marjorie Taylor Greene in specific, I think, is uniquely interesting because when you take a look at where we are in the grand scheme of electoral politics, Marjorie Taylor Greene doesn't just do the worst when it comes down to head-to-head against Jon Ossoff by a small margin. She is in the worst position possible out of all of them. Brian Kemp, again, in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution poll, what did we see? That he was defeating Jon Ossoff by roughly 3 points. But what did we see? Same sets of polls with Marjorie Taylor Greene on the ballot against Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff, again, the margin here was 3 points in favor of the GOP with Brian Kemp at the top of their ticket. When it came down to Marjorie Taylor Greene, they were losing. They were losing by 17%. Jon Ossoff was getting 46% of the vote when he was up against Brian Kemp. Against Marjorie Taylor Greene, that expands to 54%. And the margin and the percent that the Republicans get goes from 49 with Kemp to 37 for Marjorie Taylor Greene. And so now that there is seemingly an appetite for Marjorie Taylor Greene to be the Republican nominee for Senate, chances are that if she gets to that nomination, I don't think she'll lose by 17, but she might come close to losing by 10, 11 points, which would have detrimental effects down the ballot in the governor's race, in the House races, in any other type of statewide or local races. Think mayoral elections and state legislative races. It would be cataclysmic for the Republican Party in Georgia. And they aren't afraid of nominating bad candidates in the past either. Although Donald Trump won this state in 2024, we have to remember the margin that he won by was far underwhelming in comparison to what it was in many of the other battleground states. Neighboring North Carolina went to Donald Trump by roughly 3 to 4 points, and a number of states shifted by even more massive amounts. Nevada shifted by a margin of 5.5%, Arizona by 5.8%, even Michigan 4.2%, Pennsylvania 2.9%. Georgia shifted by 2.4%. And on the national shift, and keeping everything into consideration with the national popular vote, we went from Biden winning by 4.5% to Trump winning by 1.5%. That is a 6-point national swing that Georgia only swung by 2.4%, outperforming the expectations and honestly, what we could have predicted. If you were to just give me the national popular vote and I was to see that Trump had won by 1.5%, I would not have assumed that Georgia would be the outlier here. That Michigan would shift by 4 and Arizona by 6, but Georgia would only shift by 2.4%. And honestly, it makes a lot of sense. Even though Donald Trump won Georgia, in comparison to his 2016 election, it actually voted for him less, right? Unlike Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, all states that were, shifting in favor of Donald Trump, but he won by larger margins in 2016. Georgia, however, he won by less compared to 2012. Georgia is 6 points to the right. Even though Obama won this election nationally and was able to really drive up minority turnout, Georgia still shifted 6 points to the left compared to 2012. 2008, same thing. Harris does better. 2004, 2000. So from the beginning of the century, Kamala Harris's performance in Georgia was higher and better performing than any other losing Democrat. And Democrats only won this state once. I point this all out to say that the environment and the circumstance set up for a strong victory for Jon Ossoff has largely been set. And with Marjorie Taylor Greene at the helm for the GOP, it won't just be an okay or comfortable victory. It will be massive in proportion in comparison to previous elections that Jon Ossoff has experienced, that any of the statewide elected Democrats have experienced. It will be fascinating to watch, but I do think it's one that is possible, and certainly, if she enters into the race, likely. Why? Because of the fact that if she gets into it, she will more than likely win this nomination because of how much she is liked amongst the most extreme members of the Republican Party, which are often the most active in voting in the Republican primary. And should she get there, all the race ratings will change in favor of the GOP, in favor of the Democratic Party. The polling numbers will be overwhelming in favor of Jon Ossoff. And we will likely see Jon Ossoff not only set up for a strong victory in 2026, but some heavy considerations for what might happen later down the ballot. Will the governor's race turn blue because Marjorie Taylor Greene is on the ballot? Will competitive House races remain or flip blue because Marjorie Taylor Greene is on the ballot? Will state legislative races change? And will Jon Ossoff be springboarded into a potential run for president or vice president, depending on the margin? Does this play into a broader scheme and a broader idea of electability for a candidate who was seemingly out of nowhere in 2019 for many of the mainstream and national Democrats, and now is being propped up with Brian Kemp out of the race, a huge loss for the GOP, a huge win for the Democratic Party. And that huge win may come in November of 2026, and one that can only be seen potentially by a double-digit victory in a state Trump won twice out of the 3 times that he ran, and a state that arguably was conducive to electing Brian Kemp potentially as senator. That wasn't a guarantee, although it might have been more likely, right? Starting off at a baseline +3 when Republicans are only down nationally by 1 or 2 and Trump is only down nationally by 5 or 6, chances are the conditions will be far worse come November 2026. If history of Trump 1 tells us anything, or really any Republican president or Democratic president tells us anything, that by the time the midterms come, Obama included, Biden included, Bush included, Clinton included, right? What happens is they're more unpopular. They lose by larger margins. And so if Kemp is only at +3 right now with an approval rating of plus 12, 15 points, he probably saw the threat that Jon Ossoff and the Democratic Party faced for him, for his future presidential ambitions. And I think what we are seeing now is that strong level on the Democratic side with a strong candidate might face an extremely weak Republican one, which would set up Georgia to be a very strong state for Democrats in 2026 in many of their up and down ballot races that could truly change the control of the state for many years to come. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.